Joining me now is best-selling author of groundbreaking works, including his latest, The War on the West. He's one of the finest thinkers of his generation, Douglas Murray. Let's start with the EU elections. Voters in 27 countries of the European Union went to the polls, and as you predicted, Europe's swing to the right continued. Right-wing parties recorded some stunning results in a number of countries, and it's quite a contrast to what we're about to see in the UK, with a hard left Labor Party almost certain to win in a landslide.
That's right, Rita. It's extraordinary. Next month, in July, the British public will get to go to the polls. After 14 years of Conservative majority rule, the Conservatives look set to have a historic defeat. There's even polls this week that would put them as the third party in Parliament beneath the Liberal Democrats. This would give a thumping majority to the Labour Party, even bigger than the Blair landslide in 1997. It's an astonishing prediction, and I think all the polls show that it's basically immovable now. And it's the result of something that you and I have talked about before, Rita, which is the extraordinary failure of the Conservative Party under now 5 prime ministers to do what the public has asked them to do. I mean, for instance, David Cameron came in 2010 promising to bring net migration down from the hundreds of thousands a year to tens of thousands. And the latest figures were almost 1 million. So the British public, from disgust at the Conservative Party and its treachery and failure of any attempt to really keep its mandate, is going to be voted out. And in the British system, there's really only one way to do that, which is to be voting in Labour. Meantime, as you say, the whole of the European continent is going to the right, and to parties indeed, which until very recently were described as far right. I noticed that the new one that the media is doing is calling parties hard right, which is a strange and suggestive title. But it seems that hard right is what we now have to call parties that we used to call far right once they actually get into power or become the main party representing their country in the European Parliament. It's an astonishing turn-up.
It is, and with the EU elections, we saw in France, Marine Le Pen's national rally had a remarkable result. Macron's now called a snap poll for later in the month, and it's interesting that in France, as elsewhere in Europe, it's largely young voters who are veering to the right. Again, a significant departure from what we see in other parts of the West. In France, they've got a charismatic 28-year-old, Jordan Bardella, who's using social media really effectively to connect with young voters. Do you see that trend being replicated in countries like Australia and US and UK, where young voters tend to vote for left-wing parties? Often even Labor's not left-wing enough for them. They're opting for parties left of Labor.
Yes, I mean, that's been the trend and the expectation, but the European continent is bucking that trend. And I think there are some obvious explanations for that. One is that the technocrats who've been in charge turn out not to be all that good at being technocrats. I mean, take the case of Emmanuel Macron. He's a respected figure. He came from nowhere, blew right through the center of French politics when he first ran. Now, he had a reputation as being an efficient technocrat. He wasn't especially inspiring, but that he could sort of do the business. Particularly, people believed him when he said that he could take charge of the economy. He was one of the grown-ups in the room. Well, 2 weeks ago, Standard & Poor downgraded the French economy just ahead of the EU election. And that is something which I think has been massively overlooked by the foreign press. When somebody says, look, I know migration's out of control. I know that we have serious security problems. I know that people keep on blowing stuff up in our country or trying to blow stuff up. After all, there was an attack that was thwarted just a couple of weeks ago from an Islamist cell that were trying to attack the forthcoming Paris Olympics. Okay, I'm trying to keep on top of that. But the main thing is that I'm in charge of the economy and I can do a good job. When that proves not to be the case, I think the voters think quite understandably, look, the thing you said you could do, you couldn't do. And there's all this other stuff you haven't done. We'll try someone else. And I think that's what's happening actually across the continent. But you're right, Rita. It's a really interesting reversal of what was expected to be the trend. Maybe we've all been led astray by this weirdo far left fringe in all of our countries who sort of portray themselves as the voice of the next generation. And maybe they're not. Maybe they're not at all. And the young French and others are actually going to the right. Jordan Bardella is one example. And the media are desperately trying to portray his victory in exactly the terms I predicted they would. The BBC's Europe editor, I don't know if she spends any time in Europe, has written about the far right being on the march. Interestingly enough, Rita, on Monday night of this week, the far left were on the march in Paris, with leading left-wing politicians among their midst, protesting and indeed in the end rioting and having to be dispersed by the Paris police. But you know what, Rita? None of the media, weirdly, have said the far left is on the march. I wonder why. It's almost as if they believe only the far right is ever able to march, whereas the far left is, of course, this entirely benign force, which is, of course, who the media really want to be in charge. So don't show them as being in a bad light.
And they decline to even call them far left. It's just left-wing parties, even if they are characterised that way, or extreme left is never used as it is for right-wing parties. We've seen Donald Trump recently join TikTok. He's trying to reach those young voters. It was a surprise move. He's had great success so far in reaching a new audience. Let's have a look at his latest post. Here he is with YouTube star Logan Paul.
And where are we? Yo, I'm scared.
Is he taking note of what is happening in Europe and recognising younger voters have to be reached via these new platforms? It can be quite difficult to get through to them in the mainstream media.
I'm sure he is. I mean, of course, Donald Trump's extraordinary success in 2016 was in large part the result of him using Twitter so well. Of course, you know, the then pre-Elon Musk Twitter couldn't forgive itself for being used in this way, and was obviously mortified. But remember how well he used Twitter. All of the ad money that his opponents were spending on the traditional networks, he didn't need to spend, because everyone was writing about him and talking about him on the basis of any moment's tweet. His two thumbs saved millions and millions of dollars of ad campaign spending. This time, it's sort of inevitable he'll try other mediums, and that TikTok will be one of them. And we'll see if it works. We'll see. There's no reason why young Americans are going to have to vote Democrat any more than why young French voters are going to have to vote for the far left parties there. But you know, Trump is, of course, an extremely engaging performer, and he's a man who grew up in the media. You know, he was a television star before he was president. He's very, very aware and very canny about using media and social media. So it'll be very interesting. I suspect that his rivals will do everything they can to cut off this way of accessing directly the public. But there won't be very much they can do.
Now, let's talk about the Hamas-Israeli war, the US-backed ceasefire proposal. The negotiations there are continuing. Hamas has sent back an unworkable counteroffer. Even the US Secretary of State Anthony Blinken acknowledges that the war's going to go on with that unworkable counter from Hamas. They're refusing to agree to a plan that would include the release of hostages in exchange for a ceasefire. But it's worth noting, Douglas, that the Biden administration has the likes of National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan, who has said some of the amendments proposed by Hamas are minor and anticipated. It's almost like he's negotiating on their behalf. So much for not negotiating with terrorists. It seems the Biden administration has some who are negotiating on behalf of terrorists.
Well, I find this latest round of peace talks to be an extraordinary set of events. Israel is trying to get the remaining hostages back. It performed, or the IDF performed, Special Forces performed an extraordinarily impressive raid this past week in which they rescued four of the poor Israelis who were stolen from the Nova party on the 7th of October last year and have been tortured and more in captivity all the last 8 months. So the Israelis want to find a way, of course, to get the hostages back. With the Americans and other interlocutors, they've got this plan, and this plan would bring an end to the war. Now, who is the party that refuses to bring an end to the war? It's Hamas. And I wonder, Rita, whether all the morons protesting on the streets of Australia and America and everywhere else in the West, calling for ceasefire, will register for even a moment that a ceasefire actually is on the table once again. And who is it that has rejected it? Hamas. And I wonder whether any of these morons will notice this. I doubt it. But if the war is going to go on, everybody can say now with 100% certainty, as you could for the last 8 months, the reason that there is no ceasefire is because of Hamas.
Absolutely. Well, the morons, as you call them, marching in the streets in Australia, they never mention Hamas. It's always like Hamas don't exist. Yep. And you are going to be involved in a debate next week where you will argue that anti-Zionism is anti-Semitism. Tell me why you think that is the case, because there are many on the left in particular who argue that being anti-Israel, being anti-Zionist is not the same as being anti-Semitic. And they point often to the fact that there are prominent Jews who call themselves anti-Zionists.
Yeah, I'm going to keep my powder dry for Toronto on Monday night. But it's
not giving it away.
I'm not giving anything away. I mean, it's a topic that's incredibly important because just look at the way in which this word Zionist is now thrown around. I mean, the disgust with which it's thrown around, the way in which this word that describes this noble and wonderful concept of Jewish statehood is being used as a slur. And, as I say, once again, I've seen it myself, saw it recently in Australia, in Melbourne and Sydney. You had protesters screaming about Zionists. Zionists, do they know what they're talking about? I don't think so. So I do want to set the record straight on some of that. I think that this is an extraordinary moment where there should be a moment of clarity in the West about this. And instead, I think that we're seeing an explosion of bigotry. And I'm looking forward to getting into the weeds in Toronto on Monday. So I think it's sold out, but anyone who wants to come to Roy Thompson Hall, perhaps they can bribe their way to get a ticket. I don't know.
Well, I pity whoever is facing you in this debate. You're not a man I would want to be having a all-out debate on, particularly on an issue like this, because I know you're passionate about it. And the debate is timely because We now have people marching in America and elsewhere in the West calling on Hezbollah to murder Zionists. And there's, it's just disturbing footage. Let's have a quick look. And I also want to get your reaction, Douglas, to what we've seen unfold after the rescue of those 4 hostages. So much criticism of Israel's tactics and the alleged collateral damage from the rescue mission. Was there another way for Israel to rescue its people? Should they have issued a warning, as the BBC suggested, before launching the mission?
It's amazing. First of all, on the Hezbollah people, just notice again, like the KKK, these people don't have the confidence to show their faces. Isn't it interesting that they're calling for support for a genocidal terrorist organization, but weirdly they cover their faces? Maybe they're not so sure of their views. Maybe they're not so proud of them. Maybe they know that Mummy wouldn't be so proud of them. Who knows? As for the sort of the raid this week, much of the media reported it as the release of 4 Israeli hostages. They weren't brave Israelis who are superbly trained went in and freed and rescued these poor 3 men and 1 woman. And the reporting on this has been absolutely despicable. You mentioned the BBC journalist who asked an Israeli official why they didn't give an advance warning of the raid in Gaza. I don't know. That's like asking somebody why they didn't go up to somebody and say, "I'm so sorry, I can't come to your surprise birthday party." I mean, the whole point of a raid like this is that it's a surprise, and the reason is that if you'd have given advance warning to Hamas in Gaza, then the hostages would most likely have been killed or spirited away to a tunnel that Hamas has built at all of our expense in the West. I'm stunned, as I've said to you before, Rita, the simple lack of empathy with the situation that the Israelis are in. They have more than 100 hostages still held by Hamas and Islamic Jihad and terror groups and journalists and others, so-called journalists in Gaza. They want to get the hostages home. If Hamas wanted to end the war, it could end it tomorrow by handing over the hostages. Israel found the opportunity to get 4 of the hostages out. They were being harbored in civilian homes, in a civilian area. And there is a war going on there. And, the people who say, there was collateral damage, there were people killed, innocent people killed. I wouldn't believe the Hamas figures, by the way, and those are the ones that most of the media have run with as ever. But even if any innocent civilians were killed, obviously that's sad. But, the problem is that it's almost like there's a moral lesson in this. Don't kidnap people and hold them in your house.
Yeah, that is a good lesson. That would reduce your chances of being involved in something like this. Before you go, I'm interested in your take on this debate that's happening online. A poll from 2023 is causing a great deal of debate among atheists, many of them embarrassed by the results. The poll found that atheists are more likely to support minors undergoing gender transition than any other religious belief. And only 1 in 3, Douglas, of atheists support a ban on transitioning minors. How can that be when atheists, that I am one, was supposed to hold science-based, evidence-based beliefs? And I have trouble reconciling that with these results.
Well, Rita, I don't think that anyone has, or any one group has a sort of prerogative on reason and rationalism. atheists tend to say that they want to adhere in their moral frames to principles of reason and rationalism. I would simply say that this is a demonstration of something we've seen many times before, which is that the most reasonable and rational people can sign up to the most unreasonable and irrational cults. The gender woo-woo transition cult is one of the cults of our time. In previous ages, some of these people would have tried to work out how to turn base metals into gold. But we don't live in an age of alchemy. We live in the age of bizarre transition surgery where cack-handed and wicked surgeons try to turn boys into girls and girls into boys. And they have as much success as alchemists did in the past. I'm very sorry for atheists who've fallen for this. But I would say that it should be a warning to them that actually, even if you make reason and rationalism your gods, you may fail to live up to your ideals. And these people in that poll, Rita, most certainly have failed to live up to those ideals.
Douglas Murray, it's always a pleasure. Thank you for your time this evening.
Great pleasure. Thank you.